I think I'm the last presenter before you all have happy hour and award ceremony, so I will try to make this entertaining, although some of the topics are not so exciting. But thank you for that introduction, Tessa. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for having me this afternoon. I haven't been to this event before, so it's nice to see some familiar faces. Hello! And meeting some new folks. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we do at Lincoln Park Zoo. So first, a little bit about us that you may or may not know is that we are the only free, privately managed zoo in the country. A lot of people are like, what? Like, how is that possible? We have a lot of amazing donors, but also as being a cultural institution in Chicago, we are so happy to be able to welcome people to the zoo to learn about what we're doing for free. We used to say that we were the oldest zoo in the country, but that sounds terrible if you think about zoos back in the day. Weren't that great? So we're like, maybe we'll shift that a little bit. Change our messaging. Most recently, we got our accreditation. We got our recent accreditation, so we are also a botanic garden and an arboretum. So we're doing a lot of great things. And we use science at Lincoln Park Zoo to learn about the animals that we care for, and also to use science-based investigations to share what we learn, to be able to guide decisions and policies. But also we want to be able to motivate people. We want to motivate people to care about the environment. We want to motivate people to care about communities where animals live and where they thrive, and even in urban environments. So we are happy to be able to talk about all of the programs that we have and welcome children, guests, and everybody to the zoo to learn about those things. Based on the agenda, I think you've already talked about biodiversity and the state of biodiversity. So you all know that our planet is impacted, our wildlife, our communities, our ecosystems, people, by the changing climate, our warming climate, as well as biodiversity loss, or the loss of the species that we share this planet with. Everything from aquatic invertebrates to mammals, fungi, tree species, plant species, and animals right here in our backyard. And so this biodiversity loss has been coined the sixth mass extinction event, as some scientists and conservationists say. And one of the statistics that I like to talk about when I'm giving presentations is the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I know you all know that. They have estimated that approximately 166,000 species that have been assessed, so through the red listing, are threatened with extinction. And more than 46,000 of those are critically endangered. And so when we think about that, that's over 25% of the species that have been assessed. That's not of all the species, just the ones that have been assessed. And so with these estimates, like tree species, for example, they're already estimating that over a third of the world's tree species are threatened with extinction. So we know that there's a lot of work for us to do when we think about climate change and biodiversity loss. So as a conservationist, those statistics I think are alarming when we hear that, and we're like, well, what are we going to do? And we know that there is a lot of pressure to balance this messaging of the need to do something, to make changes, to act swiftly and boldly, but we also have to do it in a way where we can give people hope. We can give people kind of the steps and the tools that they can use to make those changes. And so we talk about the ways that we can do that so that we can hopefully change trajectories that have been forecasted thus far. And so what we talk about, what we say is it requires a lot of delicate and purposeful messaging. And for me, this is where I see the value of what we're doing at the zoo and what we do with a lot of our colleagues like you that are in the room. And we have this amazing opportunity. And quite frankly, I think it's our obligation to share the messaging about wildlife, to talk about the challenges that they're facing from biodiversity loss and climate change. And sometimes it doesn't feel like an easy task and an easy feat, but we think it's an important mission that we can work all together collaboratively to be able to do this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas and the projects that we work on to bring awareness to the impact of climate change and biodiversity loss on species, and some of the ways that we're doing our part to mitigate some of those losses and impacts. And some of my favorite species were on that slide.
For no votes for the winner.
Love it. Thanks, Ron. There's a parrot coming up too that you like. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in the northern region of the Republic of Congo in the Congo Basin. There are a couple of really unique things about the Congo Basin. One you all might know, but it is the second largest rainforest in the world, second to the Amazon. So as such, sometimes you hear people talk about the Congo Basin as being the lungs of Africa. And we all know how critically important that is and what those forests represent. And number two, it's the only place in the world where you find Western lowland gorillas and central chimpanzees living together, using the same resources in the same trees. Our scientists have some pretty fun stories about when gorilla babies and chimp babies are playing together and the moms are like, get over here. But those are for another time. And some of the work that we do has been working alongside Congolese researchers and scientists, NGOs, and the government to really conduct some groundbreaking research into how gorillas and chimpanzees live side by side in this pristine landscape. And we're also learning about how communities of people are sharing those same resources, like the trees and the plants, and are working together to preserve them, which is a critically important part of the process. I think when we're talking about conservation, and you all may have talked about this earlier today, when we're talking about conservation, we're talking about people. People are what are going to be driving conservation messages and stories, and how we can connect with governments, connect with communities. So by learning about some of the tree species that are important not only to the chimps and to the gorillas, we've been able to work with logging companies in the region that have really long contracts. We're talking about 30 to 50-year contracts to log in this area. And because we've been working there for over 30 years, we've been able to identify, along with the communities, certain tree species that are really important to the animals, but also individual trees that have been there 300, 400, 500 years in order for the logging companies to prioritize not logging those spaces. And so that's been a really important part of what we've done. I'm happy to say that in 2023, through work that we were doing in this area, there's a little tiny area called the Jeke Triangle was outside of the national park, where a lot of the chimps and gorillas, mammals and bird species were, wasn't previously protected. And through all of this long-term work, about 36 square miles was included into the national park and forest, and those areas are now protected. But there are also climate pressures that is being experienced in the Congo Basin. I didn't mention this in the last slide, but it is the longest running study of chimps and gorillas in the Congo Basin in this area called Gualogo and Mandika. You can see these at the Enoble Ndoki National Park there. And fires in particular have doubled in the last 2 decades in the Congo Basin. So in the red here, you can see these are fires that have been tracked in the last 10 years. And so understanding how the changing climate is impacting the Congo Basin has been one of the priorities and objectives of our scientists. And they have just been able to put these data together that shows the increase of fire in this region is not only impacting people, but it's also impacting the communities of animals that are there. And on top of that, they're facing deforestation as well as illegal logging, as well as illegal poaching. So there are a lot of things and a lot of impacts. But we know now that there's a pretty clear story about how deforestation is impacting the ecosystem, but also how climate is now a factor when we're thinking about those impacts to humans and also wildlife. I was fortunate enough to travel to the Congo last April, and what's really interesting is the scientists and the trackers were explaining some of the fruiting trees have been changing the frequency and the time in which they're fruiting. That coincides with when some of the animals are giving birth or when some of the birds are hatching. And so that shift and change really can impact not only human communities, but animal communities in those spaces. So I'm going to leave Central Africa and we're going to pop over to East Africa and talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in Tanzania and the focus of coexistence in that space. So here we're working with a lot of communities around the Serengeti National Park to evaluate the impacts of the conservation interventions aimed at helping people and wildlife coexist. I was listening to Juan, and we were talking about creating some conservation strategy, but you don't think about how it's going to impact other ecosystems or other communities. That can be a problem sometimes, and you can get a lot of pushback from communities. So Tanzania is really important because it has some of the highest density of iconic species in Africa. So obviously like African lions, African painted dogs, or African wild dogs, depending on which nomenclature you like. Zebra, giraffe, hippos, and for the birders in the room, I think there was a birding presentation earlier. There are over 1,100 species of birds in that space. And what's really interesting about Tanzania is 28% is considered protected land, and 20% of those lands have been set aside for biodiversity, which is all really great stuff. But what's important to note that while this area is protected and these protections are in place in Tanzania, Tanzania also has the highest number of threatened species of all species in Africa. So lion populations, for example, have dropped more than 50% since 1993 across all of Africa, and Tanzania has about 50% of the remaining lion population in Africa. So lion populations, again, some of the declines are due to things that you can guess: habitat loss, reduced prey, but also conflict with communities. So when we think about our predator species here, we might have coyotes here in Chicago. But imagine having to live alongside lions that might be right outside your boma. So what our scientists do are working with local organizations and NGOs like Hope Lion, for example, the local government, and communities to collaborate on reducing these human-lion conflicts to eliminate one of the biggest drivers of lion declines, which is retaliatory killings that happen in different communities. And Cope Lion, for example, works directly with villages and communities to employ what are called lion guardians, or the Ilchakuti. And these are people who go out, they protect livestock, they work with communities. They may have been those who killed lions in the past, but are now working to protect lions. So being in that community and supporting the community is something that is really important to Cope Lion. All again in the hopes to reduce further lion declining populations and kind of restore that connectivity that Juan was talking about between these ecosystems in the Serengeti and the Ngorongoro crater. On to birds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do with population sustainability. And like understanding the lion population in the Serengeti and the Ngorongoro crater, we're also working to learn more about other small populations. So for wildlife to thrive in human care, like in zoos or sanctuary settings, for example, we really need to understand how a population might change over time, how it might grow, how it might decline, or how it's stable, and then figure out some of these management strategies that we can use to help those populations thrive. So on this slide is a picture of two critically endangered species, the American red wolf. I'm not going to talk about that. We talked about the Mexican red wolf a little bit, but also we have the Puerto Rican parrot. Both are endemic here, and both almost went extinct in the 1990s. Their population dropped to about 10 to 12 individuals. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we did and are continuing to do with Puerto Rican. And I think there's people in the room here who've also worked on Puerto Rican parrots. Kelvin, I see you back there. So using the parrots as an example, we work directly with the recovery program agencies, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Puerto Rican Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, to provide this population biology expertise in an effort to help them use the best science-based management decisions for both reintroductions and the breeding program. And so we're able to do that in a variety of ways. Since 2006, our colleagues have recorded everything, or used to record everything, on paper. So when they first brought those 13 birds into a captive breeding program, this is how they were recording and tracking everything. I could not imagine having to do that. And so at Lincoln Park Zoo, we had created a software program called PopLink that was available for anybody to use for free, including conservation practitioners. And it allows for all that data that's written in hand on paper to be put into this stud book or this program so that they can keep track of all those individuals. So the historic population as well as the current population. And so the biologists are able to enter all that information. I happen to be the stud bookkeeper, so they send all that information to me every month. I combine it and look for errors, and then I find all these cute notes about different birds that I want to see when I go. And then I send that back to them for them to continue to update that information. And so what we can also do is, and what we have been doing is helping them then create an analysis. So they're able to then look at which pairs are good pairs to breed, which pairs might need to be separated, which ones have put enough genes out into the population that they don't need to be together anymore, and which ones do we need to think about putting back into the population or even releasing. So all of this is in an effort to keep the population growing, to meet those recovery goals, which is to have a self-sustaining population across the island of Puerto Rico. But as you can imagine, that requires a lot of resources. They've been doing this since 1967. It's 2006 now. You can imagine how many billions of dollars have gone into this. And part of the program and the part of trying to figure out how to keep this population going and thriving has been thinking about creating all of these different models. So a population viability analysis is what it's called. And so this considers looking at potential impacts to the population over time so that the wildlife biologists and the scientists can determine how to best spend those resources on the recovery program. And one of the things that's always been considered is hurricanes. Historically, the projections or the models included a once in 100-year hurricane. Well, that's not happening anymore. And so our scientists in the recovery program had to really think about how often are we going to think that these hurricanes are going to potentially impact the population and hit the island. And not only how often, but the intensity of the hurricane. So the previous model, the models from the 1990s, projected Category 5 hurricanes because that is what was typical. Well, now what we know is based on 2017 Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, which hit the island, those were Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes. That was a significant impact to the population. And so this is a picture on the left from Rio Bajo State Forest when some birds are feeding. And this is a picture I took on the road to El Duque National Forest after the hurricanes in 2007. So you can see that significant impact. Not only there's an impact to people, but also to where the birds are going to be nesting. There's no nesting trees anymore. There's nothing to protect them from the red-tailed hawks. And another species that's a critically endangered hawk that's also eats the Puerto Rican parrot sometimes. So that can be really challenging. So again, there are a lot of impacts to Puerto Rican parrots and to the program that needs to be considered when we're thinking about best management strategies for the parrots moving forward. So we're going to come back home. We're going to come to Chicago and talk a little bit about what our ecologists are doing in the Urban Wildlife Institute, where they're working here in Chicago to understand how animals are adapting to urban areas and also to understand how changing urban environments impacts wildlife and even impacts people, because some of those wildlife neighbors may be those that you don't want to have as your neighbors, such as rats. And so we also work with other scientists that are building wildlife-friendly cities around the world. We do this through our Urban Wildlife Information Network. We call that UN for short. And this is really an alliance of dedicated scientists that are working together to try to understand how are urban animals utilizing cities across the globe. So while we started in Chicago, we had scientists that reached out and said, well, we want to study our urban wildlife and how are we going to do this? And so we created this kind of standardized way for folks to collect data and now have the largest global data set of urban wildlife studies in the world, which is pretty exciting. And one of our examples of how we talk about this coexistence is the Chicago Wildlife Management and Coexistence coexistence plan. So we were able to work with the city of Chicago to kind of create this plan. It used to be animals were in control. The idea being like, how do you control wildlife? But we really wanted to talk about how are we coexisting with wildlife, particularly as our environments are becoming more and more urban. We're spreading out into different environments where we haven't been before, and wildlife is there, and you're going to be there. So this coexistence plan can be used as a template for other cities to use to hopefully promote that coexistence model. But also happening in Chicago and honestly around the world is illegal wildlife trafficking, which is having an alarming impact on biodiversity loss everywhere. Illegal wildlife trafficking and trade is considered to be the fourth most global lucrative crime after drug trafficking, human trafficking, and arms or weapons trafficking. And so it's estimated, I mean, it's obviously an illicit practice, so it's really hard to get those estimates, but it estimates about $7 to $23 billion per year, which is mind-boggling to me. And so species can be poached for a variety. I'm sorry, this should have a warning. It could be poached for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's for food, as in the case for sharks and rays. Sometimes it can be for some traditional medicines that may be considered cures for things like rhinos that are poached for their horn, or elephants that might be poached for ivory, or even for fashion items sometimes, like skins or pelts or shells like that of turtles and tortoises. Or even for songbirds, particularly, and turtles, and our North American turtles in particular are poached quite a bit for the pet trade. This is an image. This is one of my favorite birds. It's a ballymina on your left, and that is in a market, a wildlife market in Java. I like to talk about this because there are multiple wildlife markets in these places, but this was about the size of a super Walmart, and it was 5 stories high and just stacked with wildlife. And so this is happening in lots of places, but it's also happening right here in Chicago. The picture on the right here is wildlife that's been confiscated throughout the U.S. and held at the National Wildlife Repository that's in Colorado. And so what we're doing is, and we think it's really important, is to raise awareness about this issue and to talk about how this isn't something that's happening somewhere else. This is also something that's happening right here in the United States. What people don't realize is that the U.S. is one of, if not the largest driver of illegal wildlife trafficking, whether it's our wildlife that's leaving the United States or whether we are a route where things are flying into the country and then flying out of the country. And so we're doing things like talking about this. We have a display at O'Hare International Airport in the international terminal to kind of raise awareness about what is illegal wildlife trafficking, so that people on their journeys can learn a little bit about it and maybe help them not inadvertently make a poor decision, like maybe taking a picture with an exotic animal that is outside of its natural environment, or picking up a trinket that might look cool that they might not, should not do that. So that's kind of a bummer. But I like to end when I'm talking about kind of hope and progress. So while we know that, Friends of the Chicago River, you're awesome. While we know that wildlife and plants are facing many threats, including those anthropogenic causes, we know that there is resilience in nature and even in people, because we are nature. And being resilient, we're able to help species and we're able to help share the planet with these species. So again, this is a picture of my favorite bird. It's a ballymina. I mean, look how beautiful it is. When I first started 30 years ago, I started as a zookeeper. And I got to work with the ballymina, and there were 6 left in the wild in 1998. They were functionally extinct, and I couldn't believe that I had this opportunity in Atlanta to be working with this species. And throughout my career, I focused my conservation efforts and storytelling of this species because it was really impactful to me, but also because I got to work with a lot of really passionate people that wanted to protect not only this species, but many other species that are endemic to Valley. This picture on the right is a picture that I took last year, 2024. In 2024, my colleagues and I were sitting and waiting at this roosting spot, and we were able to count 453 Valley miners flying to roost. So again, despite the pressures that the species has faced, primarily poaching for the pet trade and also climate impact, they are making a comeback. And so it's a story of hope for me. I think it's one that I like to end on. We're thinking about all of the pressures that we're facing, the climate is facing, biodiversity is facing, that there are things that we can do if we're working together and working with the community to help protect wildlife and ourselves. So with that, I'm happy to ask or answer any questions, but I think you're
Yeah, we have time if there are
questions.
Any questions?
Yes.
What is the Valley Mina like? What's their personality?
Oh, what's the Valley Mina like? They are the sassiest thing. They are about 90 grams. They're a starling species. And so what's really interesting is, one, they can repeat. And so that's one of the things that people were interested in getting them for the pet trade. But they're also, to be so tiny, they're very bossy. They're very fun to be around, and they have a beautiful song. As a lot of songbirds are poached for their songs, they do have a pretty song. Thanks for that. Any other questions?
I find it interesting that we care about the species as a whole, but when we come across an individual of the species, then there's a very unique connection. I was telling the story of El Jefe, that jaguar that captured the imagination of people in Arizona, and how these individual animal stories really matter. And I think that zoos have a unique opportunity in connecting with individual animals. I was wondering if you wanted to share a story of an individual animal that moved.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a great question. Well, I will say the individual happened to be the Valley Mina. His name was Saki, and he happened to be a hand rear bird. So every morning when we walk past his habitat, he'd say, Saki, get on me, Saki. And so again, and there were these 6 left in the wild, and I just couldn't believe like how smart and how amazing it was. So for me, that was the individual that really made the connection. But I do like and appreciate that you talked about the connection and the empathy that we can build in zoos, right? A lot of people have questions and thoughts about the ethics of having zoos in these, or having animals in these spaces. But when we have those moments where people are making that connection, I don't know a lot of people that have an opportunity to go to the Republic of Congo to see gorillas and chimpanzees, or to go to Africa on a safari to see lions. But when they come to the zoo, we can see the light in their eyes. We can hear about the stories that they're hearing and how they're taking those stories home and might make a change at home. So I appreciate you saying that there is that connection that we can have and we can make through zoos. Thanks for that. I think we have time for one more question. Try to answer them all.
Got one?
There's one.
There's one.
By the way, I know the Lincoln Park Zoo with their urban wildlife program has some citizen science programs going on. I wondered if we could just go over the ones that we can contribute sightings to, if there still are any.
Absolutely, yes. We have a couple of programs. One, I don't know if you know about the bat monitoring program. So bat volunteers can go out. Bats are facing extreme pressures all around the world, but particularly in cities. And so that is a program that you can participate in when you go to different communities. Our bat tracker volunteers have backpacks, so you can go and kind of figure out which species you're hearing. We also have we participate in the Zooniverse or Chicago Wildlife Watch. And so you can go in and help us track all of the images that we're seeing from our camera traps throughout the city. And that helps contribute to that Urban Wildlife Information Network that I was talking about, where we're gathering all this data to be able to answer questions in the future that we might have about urban urban wildlife in our cities. So those are two.
Do you still have a coyote sighting?
That's part of it. So again, if we see coyotes on those images, like we would track that, not a specific one, but yeah.
And I know there's a nighthawk one, but that's not you guys.
We have black crowned night herons that come to the zoo as a population, and they cause havoc, but they're amazing. And that population, those numbers have been going up for a long time. We expect that they're going to disperse at some point and not be at the zoo, but while they're here, like, we love them. They also roost over the exhibit, so we're like, oh, that's fascinating. We think that there's a reason for that. Scientists talk about that quick there. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. These were just such incredible presentations today. I've taken copious notes, my head is spinning. And my job now is really to wrap us up with going all the way from Africa back here to Chicago, and then very intimately back to the Chicago-Calumet River system to bestow the Chicago River Blue Awards.